My husband, Mark, sold me on an open marriage as a progressive solution to save our lost connection. He gave me 3 rules. Complete honesty. Our emotional connection remains primary. No professional entanglements. I'm a data analyst. I like rules. I agreed to the new parameters, believing I was running a logical diagnostic on a failing system. I didn't realize, until I saw the $50,000 transfer to his mistress, that the rules weren't a fix. They were a smokescreen. He hadn't just given me a solution. He'd handed me the instruction manual for how he was going to rob me blind. For the first 2 months, the system ran as designed. We had our weekly check-in dinners, always on a Tuesday, always at a neutral public restaurant. It was part of the clean separation, another of Mark's little rules. I'd had a few dates myself. A divorced architect, a sociology professor. They were data points. Predictable inputs, predictable outputs. We had polite conversation, we had clinically decent sex, and I went home, logged the encounter in my mental spreadsheet, and felt nothing. No spark, no danger, and certainly no connection. If anything, it reinforced the logic of Mark's plan. These excursions were sterile, functional. They were just noise, and they made me appreciate the baseline signal of my 20-year marriage. I was the one who was truly following the rules. I was sitting in a noisy, trendy bistro that smelled of burnt Brussels sprouts and expensive gin, tapping my fingernail against the watery ring my glass had left on the marble tabletop. Mark was 7 minutes late. Punctuality had never been one of his core competencies. He finally breezed in, all apologies and kinetic energy, shrugging off his jacket. Sorry. Call ran long. You ordered? Just wine, I said, gesturing to the bottle of Sancerre cooling in a silver bucket beside the table. He flashed me a grateful smile, sat down, and immediately placed his phone on the table, face up, a cardinal sin in my book. But I let it go. We had bigger fish to fry, so, I said as he settled in, the check-in. Right, check-in. He sipped his wine without tasting it. All good on my end. Busy. You? Productive, I said. I met a sociology professor. He was adequate. We discussed Max Weber's theories on bureaucracy. It was very thorough. No emotional risk, Mark nodded, but his eyes kept flicking down to his phone screen. That's great, Evie. Safe, clean, see? It's working, is it? I asked, my voice flat. Rule 1, Mark. Honesty. He looked up, a little startled. What? I've been completely honest. I told you about the marketing VP last month. It was fine, it ended. You told me about the architect. It's all above board. You've been staring at your phone since you sat down, I said. You're smiling at it. That's not a smile for a client. He had the decency to look sheepish, but underneath it, he was buzzing. He was excited. He wanted to be caught. You're right. You're right, honesty. He leaned forward, his voice dropping, but his eyes were bright, conspiratorial. I met someone. Her name is Anya. Anya. The name was soft, foreign. It didn't sound like a data point. And? I prompted, keeping my tone perfectly level. I was a scientist observing a new variable. And? He let out a small, breathless laugh. It was a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. She's incredible, Evie. Just incredible. She's a spiritual entrepreneur. Young, full of energy. I felt a small, cold prickle. He was describing her, not the act. But I needed more data. Physically? Oh, sure, she's beautiful. He waved his hand dismissively, as if that were a boring technical detail. But that's not it. It's her mind, her energy. She gets my creative process. She understands what I'm trying to build. The sounds of the restaurant, the clatter of plates, the roar of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, all of it seemed to recede. Tunneling into a dull background roar, he was still talking. We were brainstorming last night, and she had this idea for my consultancy, a whole new vertical. It was brilliant. It's like she can see the things I'm trying to say. He stopped, searching for the word. A connection, I finished for him, the words tasting like metal. His face lit up, absolutely radiant. Exactly, a real true connection. God, Evie, it's been amazing. I just stared at him. The rules were clear. Rule 2, emotional connection remains primary. He had just, with a beaming smile, confessed to the one cardinal sin. This wasn't an outlet. This wasn't clean. He wasn't outsourcing sex. He was outsourcing me. I had been worrying about the physical act, about STDs, about logistical complications. I had built a firewall for the wrong threat. The virus wasn't in the hardware. It was in the code. Evie? He asked, his smile finally faltering as he registered the look on my face. What's wrong? I'm being honest, just like we agreed. Isn't this the point? I picked up my wine glass, my hand perfectly steady. The glass was cool, solid. I looked at my husband, at this happy, energized stranger sitting across from me, and I felt the first sharp, agonizing prick of real fear. It wasn't jealousy. It was the cold, analytical certainty of an analyst who has just seen the data point that proves the entire model is wrong. The system wasn't just failing. It was a catastrophe. I drove home from the bistro in a focused, analytic calm. The fear had crystallized into something else. It was an anomaly, a data point that had corrupted the entire set. She just gets my creative process. The words echoed with the precise, rhythmic thwack-thwack of my wipers against the windshield, clearing a light Portland drizzle. When I got home, the house was dark, save for the single spotlight over the quartz island. Mark's bourbon glass was still there, a sticky amber ring marring the white surface, a violation of our unspoken rules of cleanliness. He hadn't come home with me. He'd texted in the car, going to clear my head. Don't wait up. A text I now understood was a courtesy. He was with her. He was with Anya. I didn't go to the bedroom. I went to my office. My office is the one room in the house that is truly mine. It's not cold and sterile. It's focused. A single wall is a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf filled with texts on quantitative analysis, machine learning, and data architecture. The other walls are whiteboards covered in the faint ghosts of old algorithms. My desk, a massive plank of reclaimed timber, faces the window overlooking the dark, rain-slicked garden. The room smelled of old paper, ozone from the server rack in the closet, and the faint, bitter trace of coffee from the mug I'd left that morning. I sat in my ergonomic chair. The mesh hissed as it took my weight. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The glow from my 3 monitors was all I needed. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I was a data scientist. I dealt in patterns. Mark's behavior was a deviation, and I needed to find the source of the variance. I started with Anya Sharma. The search engine offered me 12 women. I added spiritual entrepreneur. The results narrowed. I added Portland. 1 result, a website I clicked. My screen flooded with soft watercolors, sunset pinks, meditative lavenders. The font was a wispy script. Anya Sharma, the site proclaimed, was a guide for energetic alignment and a curator of synergistic manifestation. It was a cascade of meaningless, aspirational jargon. I clicked through pages titled The Journey, The Awakening, The Vessel. It was nonsense. Harmless, vapid, expensive nonsense. I almost closed the tab. This woman was a grifter, a seller of spiritual snake oil. Mark, with his flailing consultancy, was probably just a moth to her very pretty flame. But the phrase creative process still bothered me. I tried a different vector. Social media. I didn't have accounts, but I knew how to look. I found her public Instagram. My screen filled with her. Anya Sharma, 29, was beautiful, of course. She was all high-contrast filters, artfully messy hair, and yoga poses in exotic locations. I scrolled. Her meditating on a rock, her drinking a green juice, her smiling into the camera, eyes bright with that specific brand of curated authenticity. I scrolled further, back weeks, then months, and then I stopped. My heart didn't pound. It just seized. It was a photo from 6 weeks ago. Anya, beaming, standing next to Mark. They were in a sleek, modern office space, all exposed brick and glass. Between them, they held a framed certificate. Mark had his arm around her waist. Not a date arm, an owner's arm. The caption, under a string of crystal and star emojis, read, "So excited to launch our new paradigm. The seed we planted is finally a sapling. Welcome to Solstice Creative Ventures." Solstice Creative Ventures. My breath hitched. This wasn't no professional circles. This was his entire professional circle. This was a new company. This was a partnership. The cold from the bistro returned, flooding my veins. My hands moved on their own, a separate, efficient machine. I opened a new tab. I pulled up the login page for our joint investment account. This was my account, really. I had opened it with a bonus I'd received a decade ago. It was the nest egg, the one I primarily funded, the one I managed. Mark had access, but he never used it. He found stocks boring. I typed in my credentials. The two-factor authentication code buzzed on my phone. The screen loaded. The balance was wrong. It was off by a significant margin. I scrolled down the transaction history, dividends, a few stock purchases I'd automated. Normal, boring, blue-chip activity, and then there, 6 weeks ago, 3 days after the Instagram photo, a wire transfer, 50,000. My eyes blurred. I blinked, forcing the numbers into focus. $50,000. The recipient was coded SCV LLC. I leaned back in my chair. The mesh creaked in the silent room. SCV, Solstice Creative Ventures, the open marriage. The rules, the honesty, it was all a script. He wasn't just gaslighting me about an emotional affair. He was using me. The man who claimed he just wanted a connection had his hand in my pocket the entire time. I needed the final data point, the one that would confirm the hypothesis. I opened another tab, the Secretary of State Business Registry. My fingers were ice as they typed SCV LLC into the search field. The page loaded. I clicked on the Articles of Organization. It was a simple, sterile PDF, a state-issued document, business name, SCV, LLC data formation. 3 days after he and I had our talk about an open marriage. I scrolled down. Registered agent, Anya Sharma. Managing member, Anya Sharma. I scrolled further to the section on authorized members. The people with a right to the capital. Member, Anya Sharma. Member, Mark Reed. I stared at the screen until the words vibrated. He hadn't just invested. He was the company. He and his spiritual guide had started a business, and my $50,000 was their seed money. The open marriage wasn't a progressive solution to save us. It was a smokescreen. It was a strategic distraction, a brilliant piece of social engineering to keep my logical, analytical brain busy tracking the emotional variables while he staged a financial coup. I wasn't his wife. I was his first-round investor, and he hadn't even had the decency to give me a pitch deck. I closed the laptop. The click of the lid was deafening in the silence. I heard it then. Down the hall, the sound of the master bedroom door opening. His footsteps, soft on the concrete. He was home from his date. I didn't move. I just sat in the dark. The ghost image of the PDF burned onto my retinas. The heist was real, and the man who had just stolen from me was about to walk into my office. The handle of my office door turned, a soft metallic snick that sliced through the silence. The door swung open. Mark stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the brighter light of the hall. He was holding his jacket, his hair damp from the rain. He looked tired but satisfied. He looked like a man coming home from a good date. "Evie, what are you doing sitting in the dark?" His voice was casual, slightly irritated. "I thought you'd be in bed." "I was working," I said. My voice was a low, steady monotone. I didn't turn in my chair. I just stared at the glowing rectangle of my center monitor. I found a discrepancy in the joint investment account. I was just running the numbers, he stiffened. The casual posture vanished. "A discrepancy? What are you talking about? Everything's fine, is it?" I reached out, my hand steady, and slowly swiveled the monitor to face him. The white and black of the Secretary of State PDF was stark in the gloom. SCV LLC, registered agent Anya Sharma, managing member Anya Sharma. He didn't move. He just stared at it. I could hear his breathing, a shallow intake of air. $50,000, Mark, I continued, my voice as level as a ruler. Wired to this LLC, an LLC you are a member of. An LLC you formed 3 days after our open marriage conversation. I swiveled the second monitor, the one with the banking transaction. The red negative figure glowed like a warning light. You've been busy, I said. Mark stepped into the room, letting his jacket drop to the floor. He didn't look at me. He looked at the screens, his face a mask of annoyance. He wasn't ashamed. He was busted. You were spying on me, he said, his voice quiet, accusatory. I was balancing our accounts, I corrected him. And I found a $50,000 hole you failed to mention. Rule 1, Mark, complete honesty. This doesn't look like honesty. This looks like fraud. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were cold. It's not fraud, Evie, for God's sake. It's an investment. An investment in what? A spiritual entrepreneur's website full of watercolor nonsense? You don't get it, he snapped, his voice rising. You can't see it, can you? You only see the numbers. You don't see the vision. Anya, she's not what you think. She's brilliant. This is a real venture, I was going to tell you. When? I asked, my voice still dangerously calm. When were you going to tell me, Mark? After you drained the account completely? When it was a success? He shouted, jabbing a finger at the screen. I wanted to show you something. Show you that I could build something on my own, without you looking over my shoulder, without your spreadsheets and your risk analysis. It was supposed to be for us, our future. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that I almost had to admire it. He was reframing his theft as a romantic gift. For us, I repeated, but it was registered to her. You used our money to start a company with your new partner. The partner you swore was just an outlet. I stood up slowly, my chair rolling back with a soft groan. The rules, Mark. We had rules. The only reason I agreed to this insane plan was the rules. And you didn't just break them. You built this entire charade on top of them. The open marriage wasn't a fix. It was a cover story. It was a distraction to keep me busy while you robbed me. I saw the shift in his eyes. He knew he'd lost the financial argument. The data was too clean, so he pivoted. He went for the emotional jugular, a distraction. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. You want to talk about the rules, Evie? Let's talk about Rule 2. Emotional connection remains primary. He stalked toward the desk until he was looming over me. I could smell the gin from the bistro on his breath, mixed with a faint floral perfume that wasn't mine. When was the last time we had that, huh? When, in the last 5 years, have you ever looked at me like anything other than a failed project? A line item on your life's budget that isn't performing? That is not— It is! He roared, slamming his palm down on my desk. The monitors jumped. This is why I needed this. This right here. Your coldness. You sit here in your data cave and you judge everything. You judge me. You judge Anya. You judge the whole world. You're not a wife, Evie. You're an auditor. The words hit me like stones. I recoiled, a physical jolt. He saw it. He saw the crack in my armor, and he shoved the knife in deeper. Yes, I have an emotional connection with Anya, he sneered. Because she's warm. Because she believes in me. She doesn't treat me like an algorithm that's spitting out the wrong answer. She treats me like a man. So you lied, I whispered, the rage finally cracking my voice. You lied and you stole. I survived, he corrected me, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. I did what I had to do, because I am drowning in this sterile, perfect, empty life with you. You're so busy tracking the data, you missed the most obvious point. Our marriage was already dead. I just found someone who made me feel alive. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. You want to call it fraud? Fine. What do you call a 20-year marriage where one person is just a ghost, a paycheck? You're upset about the 50 grand? I'm upset about the last decade. You're the one who broke the connection, Evie, not me. I just found a new one. He held my gaze for a second longer, his eyes filled with nothing but contempt and a chilling kind of relief. He had said it. He had finally said it all. He turned, snatched his jacket off the floor, and stalked out of the office. I stood there, motionless, my hands flat on the reclaimed timber of my desk. The wood felt rough beneath my palms. I heard the front door open, the sound of his car keys jingling, and then the slam of the door echoing through the perfect, empty house. The engine of his car roared to life and then faded down the street, leaving behind only the sound of the rain and the quiet, insistent hum of my servers. I looked at the screens. The LLC, the transfer, the smiling photo of him and Anya. He was right. I was an auditor, and I had just completed my audit. My marriage was not a failing system. It was a fraudulent enterprise, and I was the only creditor. I stood in the dark of my office for a long time after he left. The silence he left behind was heavy, thick, and absolute. His words hung in the air, clearer than any data visualization I had ever built. Cold, auditor, a ghost, a paycheck. He was right. I was an auditor. I had been auditing our marriage for years, noting the discrepancies, the emotional deficits, the dwindling returns. And he, the charismatic CEO of our shared life, had been cooking the books. There was no tearful breakdown. The grief I felt wasn't hot. It was a pressurized, sub-zero cold. It was the icy calm of a system that has just purged a catastrophic error and is rebooting in safe mode. I turned back to my desk. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat down, my hands moving over the keyboard with renewed purpose. I closed the LLC registry tab. I closed the bank transaction. I opened a new encrypted spreadsheet, a clean slate. In cell A1, I typed Project Sunset. My mind was clear. The objective was no longer to save the connection. The objective was asset recovery and liability isolation. He had called me a ghost. He was about to find out how terrifying a ghost in the machine could be. By 4 a.m., the room smelled of burnt, bitter coffee, and my screen was filled with names. I hadn't just been auditing our accounts. I had been researching. I found her, Diane Barnes, a divorce attorney whose online reviews used words like shark, ruthless, and uncompromising. I sent a 4:05 a.m. email requesting an immediate emergency consultation. Then I found a forensic accountant, a man who specialized in unwinding creative partnerships. I slept for exactly 90 minutes in my office chair. When I woke, the sun was a weak, gray smear against the window, and my phone was vibrating on the desk. A reply from Diane Barnes's office. Ms. Barnes can see you at 9. First, the apology. I showered, dressed in a simple gray cashmere sweater. I made myself look soft, defeated. I dialed Mark's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and annoyance. What, Evie? I'm so sorry, Mark, I whispered, pitching my voice to sound broken, fragile. I let a tremor enter it. There was a silence on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of movement, bedsheets rustling. He was with her. Good. Sorry for what? He asked, his voice wary. For everything, I said, letting a tear I'd manufactured roll down my cheek, even though he couldn't see it. The sound of the tear was what mattered. You were right. About everything. I am cold. I'm an auditor. I looked at your investment, and I just saw numbers. I didn't see your passion. I didn't see your vision. I was feeding him his own lines, buttered and served hot. He was quiet. I could practically hear his ego inflating. He was winning. Evie, he started, his tone softening, becoming magnanimous. No, let me finish, I plowed on. I was just scared. I was controlling. I see that now. And I don't want to lose you. Not completely. I want to support you. I want to support your investment in Anya. For your future. I said your future, not our. A detail he would miss. You mean that? He asked. He sounded relieved and profoundly arrogant. He'd done it. He'd gaslit me into submission. I do, I said. I truly do. Well, he said, clearing his throat. Good, that's very mature of you, Evie. I'm glad you see it. There's just one thing, I added, my voice small. All our finances. They're so tangled. It's confusing. It's why I get so stressed and so controlling. I was thinking maybe we should simplify for my peace of mind. So I don't feel like I have to audit everything, you know? So I can give you the freedom you deserve to build your company. Simplify how? He asked, suddenly cautious again. Just separate things. Draw a clean line. You take your projects, I take mine. It's an act of trust, so you know I really support you. He was silent for a beat. Then, that actually makes a lot of sense, Evie. Clean. I like that. I'll come by tonight. We can talk. Thank you, Mark, I whispered. I hung up. I wiped a single tear from my face. Phase 1 was complete. Diane Barnes's office smelled of expensive leather and freesia-scented air freshener. She was a woman in her 50s, all sharp angles and sharper eyes, dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my first car. She didn't offer me coffee. She just motioned for me to sit. I didn't give her an emotional story. I gave her the data. I pushed a thin file across her glass desk. My husband formed an LLC with his mistress 3 days after convincing me to start an open marriage. He then transferred $50,000 from a joint investment account, which I primarily fund, to that LLC. Diane opened the file. Her eyes scanned the bank statement, the LLC registration. She didn't flinch. A tiny, thin smile played on her lips. He's arrogant, she said. It wasn't a question. And parasitic, I replied. And you? She asked, looking up at me. What do you want, Dr. Reed? I want him gone, and I want to protect my assets. He thinks I'm apologizing. He thinks I'm agreeing to simplify our finances as an act of trust. He's coming over tonight to discuss it. Diane leaned back in her chair. A post-nuptial agreement, she said, tapping a long, red-painted fingernail on the glass. Not a separation, not yet. A post-nup is friendlier. It's us getting our ducks in a row. It's an act of love. She said the word with surgical precision. We give him what he thinks he wants, she continued, her eyes gleaming. He wants the LLC? He gets the LLC. We will draft an agreement that cedes all interest in Solstice Creative Ventures and its associated accounts to him. We'll even transfer more money into it as a good faith gesture. Give him more money? In exchange, she said, he signs over his interest in this house. He waives all claims, current and future, to your personal 401k, your stock options, and your private retirement fund. He'll see the immediate cash from the LLC. He'll see his freedom. He won't see that he's trading a multi-million-dollar portfolio for a shell company that's already in debt. He's taken out loans, I said, remembering the forensic accountant's initial finding. Against our assets. Even better, Diane smiled. The agreement will state that he assumes all debts associated with the assets he's taken. We give him his company, and we saddle him with all the leverage he's used to build it. He'll be signing his own bankruptcy petition. She had her paralegal drafted in 2 hours. It was a masterpiece of dense, impenetrable legalese, but the core of it was exactly as she described. That night, Mark came home. He was showered, wearing a fresh shirt, and smelled faintly of Anya's floral perfume. He was magnanimous, the benevolent winner. So, he said, sitting on the sofa, declining my offer of a drink. This simplifying idea, what did you have in mind? I placed the document on the glass coffee table between us. It was in a simple blue folder. I had my lawyer draw this up. It's just a post-note to, like you said, draw a clean line. It gives you full, uncontested control of the LLC and the funds for it. It just separates my retirement and the house so I can stop worrying. So I can stop being the auditor I used to be. His word, it was the key. He picked it up. We opened it. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I saw the moment he processed the clause, giving him sole control of Solstice Creative Ventures. I saw the flash of triumph. He flipped a few more pages, his eyes glazing over the dense blocks of text about liabilities, waivers, and fiduciary responsibilities. He was looking for the catch, but the catch was wrapped in the prize. It seems fair, he said, trying to sound casual. I just want this to work, Mark, I said, looking at my hands. I want you to be happy, he smiled. That bright, arrogant, relieved smile. Anya's going to be so thrilled, he said, almost to himself. This is it. This is the trust I've been talking about. He looked at me. Where do I sign? I pushed a pen across the table. He didn't read the attachments. He didn't read the schedules of assets and liabilities my accountant had meticulously prepared. He just flipped to the last page, to the signature line. He signed his name with a flourish, a fast, upward slanting scrawl. The sound of the pen scratching on the heavy paper was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of the trap snapping shut. He slid the folder back to me, a picture of magnanimity. There, he said, standing up. Simple, clean. He kissed me on the top of my head, a dry, dismissive gesture of thanks. I've got time. Anya's waiting. We're celebrating. Celebrating how? I asked, my voice soft. Our future, Evie, he said, grabbing his feet. Our future. He walked out the front door, whistling. I sat on the sofa, holding the blue folder. I opened it and looked at his signature. It was done. Aperture was the kind of restaurant that didn't have a sign, only an address. It was a glass box on the 30th floor, overlooking the rain-slicked lights of the city. The air smelled of truffle oil, seared scallops, and the faint, dusty sweetness of very old wine. It was a place designed for closings, for deals, for executions. I was 10 minutes early. I'd requested this table, a quiet, semicircular booth in the far corner, upholstered in dark gray velvet. It offered a panoramic view of the city and a tactical view of the entire room. I sat with my back to the wall. I was sipping ice water, the glass cold and heavy in my hand. When they arrived, they were late, of course. A power move. Mark swept in, wearing a new, sharply cut blazer of blue so bright it hurt the eyes. He was thinner than his. Anya, tucked under his arm, was a cloud of cream-colored cashmere and that same sickly sweet floral perfume. She was glowing, radiant with the kind of confidence that only comes from getting everything you've ever wanted. They saw me and smiled. That synchronized, smug smile of a team that had just won the championship. Evie, Mark said, sliding into the booth. He kissed the air near my cheek, a dry, dismissive walk. Anya sat beside me, not opposite, pressing her shoulder against his. A clear, territorial signal. Mark. Anya, I said, my voice perfectly pleasant. The mask was on, securely fastened. Thank you both for coming. Of course, Anya trilled, picking up the heavy, embossed name. Her fingernails were painted a bright, predatory red. Mark said this was a new beginning dinner. I think that's just so incredibly evolved of you, Evelyn. Evolved, I repeated, nodding. A waiter appeared, silent as a rain. Champagne, Mark announced, not asking me. The best you have. We're celebrating, the waiter bowed and vanished. Celebrating the post-nut? I asked. Among other things, Mark said, draping his arm over the back of the booth, his hand resting just behind Anya's neck. Celebrating trust and honesty. The new venture is, well, it's taking off. Anya's a genius. We're already scouting a larger office space. That's wonderful news, I said, my smile feeling like a crack in porcelain. The champagne arrived. The cork was eased out with a polite, expensive kiss. 3 tall flutes were filled with pale, bubbling gold. Mark raised his glass. To Solstice Creative Ventures. To the future. He looked at Anya, his eyes soft and adoring. And to you, Evie, for finally seeing the vision. To simplify. Anya raised her glass, that sharp red nail tapping the crystal. To simplifying, she echoed, her eyes meeting mine over the rim, sparkling with unconcealed triumph. I raised my glass. To simplify, I said. I took a sip. The champagne tasted like acid. I set the glass down. I'm so glad you're both here. Because there is just one last piece of paperwork to finalize this week. A formality. I checked my watch. 7:30 p.m. on the dot. I know how busy you are, so I took the liberty of asking my lawyer to join us, I said, my voice still low. Just to go over the final papers and get them notarized. Ah, here she is now. Mark's glass stopped halfway to his lips. Anya's smile furrowed. Diane Barnes moved through the restaurant like a missile. Her navy blue suit was armored. Her heels made no sound on the thick carpet. She She wasn't carrying a purse. She was carrying a heavy black leather satchel. She did not smile. She stopped at our table and looked down at Mark and Anya as if they were specimens on a slide. Eva, what the hell is this? Mark hissed, his smile vanishing. Who is this? This, I said, my voice changing, the warmth evaporating, is Diane Barnes, my attorney. And this, Mark, isn't a celebration. It's a board meeting, and you're the only item on the agenda. I saw the color drain from his face. Anya looked from him to me, her eyes wide with confusion. Mark, I said, leaning forward. My voice was the sub-zero calm of my office at 3 a.m. You signed the post-nuptial agreement. I have my copy right here. Diane placed a thin blue folder on the table. As you know, it gives you full, uncontested control of Solstice Creative Ventures and all its associated accounts. Congratulations. Anya looked at Mark, beaming. Mark, that's it also, I cut her off. Details your waiver. You signed over all rights to this house and all claims present and future to my personal 401k, my stock options, and my private retirement fund. A fund worth just shy of $7 million. Mark's hand, the one on the back of the booth, clenched. It was a fair trade, Evie. My vision for your security. That's where the data gets interesting, I said. I nodded to Diane. She placed a second, much quicker, spiral-bound report on the table. It landed with a soft, heavy, final thud. The sound was obscene in the quiet restaurant. The cover read, SCV LLC Forensic Audit. My forensic accountant finished his audit this morning, I said. The LLC you've been funding? It's insolvent. The $50,000 you stole from me was just the start. You've been siphoning from our joint lines of credit for months. That's a lie. Mark blurted out, his voice too loud. A few heads turned. It's all in the report, I said, tapping the cover. The wire transfers, the invoices for your new office furniture, the lease on your apartment. I turned my gaze to Anya. Her face was pale, her mouth a small O of horror. The loans Mark took out against our former joint assets are now all due. And since he is the sole director and owner of the LLC, as per the post-note he so eagerly signed, I turned back to Mark. His skin was slick with a sudden greasy sweat. They are his sole responsibility. You're not just broke, Mark. You're in debt for over $500,000. The post-note protects me from all of it. Every last penny. Anya made a small, strangled sound. She wasn't looking at him with adoration now. She was looking at him with pure, undiluted hatred. You told me, she whispered, her voice shaking. You told me it was clean. It is, I said. It's all his. Mark just stared at the eye, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. He was speechless. Diane, seeing her cue, stepped forward. She unzipped her satchel and pulled out one last thin file. She slid it across the table until it stopped inches from Mark's hand. My client is divorcing you on grounds of fraud, Diane said, her voice cutting through the ambiance. You've been served. I stood up. My legs were perfectly steady. I looked down at the two of them. The power couple, the visionaries. He, white-faced, sweating commune. She, his horrified, duped accomplice. My lawyer, I said, nodding to Diane. My accountant. I gestured to the report. My house, my money. I looked at Mark. His eyes met mine, and they were filled with a terrifying, bottomless panic. He had finally seen the numbers. Our connection is finally truly lost, I said. Good luck. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it on the table. For the drinks, I said. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I walked past the silent, staring diners, past the bar, and into the elevator. As the door slid shut, I was alone. The elevator began its smooth, silent descent. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in 20 years, the air felt clean. I didn't take the elevator all the way down to the lobby. I pressed the button for the second floor, the parking garage. The ding of the arriving elevator was offensively cheerful. I stepped out into the damp, concrete-scented air. My heels clicked with a sharp, solitary echo. I got into my car, a sensible, silent electric sedan, and pulled out of the garage, merging seamlessly into the wet, glittering traffic. I drove. I didn't go straight home. I drove through the city, past the glowing storefronts, the rain-slicked parks, the blurred faces of people huddled under awnings. I was just a pair of headlights in a long stream of data. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, it was past 10. The house was dark, exactly as I had left it. I keyed in the code, the electronic beep boop beep, a familiar comfort. The lock snicked open. I stepped inside. The sterile smell of lemon and bleach greeted me. I put my satchel in its designated spot on the chrome console table. I took off my coat and hung it, perfectly centered in the closet. I walked to the kitchen. The white quartz island was gleaming under the single spotlight, just as it had been when Mark first proposed his solution. His empty bourbon glass, with its sticky amber ring, was still there from the night of our fight. A final, lingering piece of corrupted data. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it. I walked to the kitchen sink, turned on the disposal, and dropped it in. The sound was a horrific, satisfying crash of grinding glass. When it was done, I ran the hot water, washing the last of him down the drain. I went to my office. My servers hummed their quiet binary song. I sat at my desk and opened Project Sunset, the spreadsheet I had started what felt like a lifetime ago. I navigated to the last tab, Execution. I typed in a single cell, Phase 4, complete. I closed the file, powered down my monitors, and sat in the dark. For the first time in 20 years, the silence in the house didn't feel cold. It didn't feel like a void. It felt like an absence. A clean, quiet, blessedly empty space. The next 2 weeks were a blur of logistics. Diane was a marvel. Mark's lawyer, a bottom feeder from a strip mall, had tried to contest the post-nup. He'd filed a motion claiming emotional duress and spousal coercion. Diane eviscerated him in a single, 3-page letter. He claimed you manipulated him, Diane told me over the phone, her voice dripping with bored contempt. The sound of her tapping her red nails on her desk was audible. I replied that his client's manipulation was, in fact, premeditated financial fraud, and that the audit proved it. I reminded him that if he chose to pursue this, our next step would be to file the audit with the district attorney. We are, after all, victims of a crime. And? I asked, looking out my office window at the gray, misty morning. And, Diane said, he's requesting a date for Mr. Reed to retrieve his personal belongings, at which point he will sign the final, uncontested divorce decree. The motion has been withdrawn. I had won. The system was purged. The day Mark came was, fittingly, a Tuesday, the day of our old check-ins. I had insisted on being there. Diane had advised against it, but I needed to see the final data point logged. I was the auditor, and I would be present for the closing of the books. I was in my office, running a regression model, when I heard the key in the lock. It was a sound that made my stomach clench, a conditioned animal response. I heard the door open, the sound of his footsteps, hesitant, not bold, and the scrape of a dolly on the concrete floor. I stayed at my desk. I heard the movers, 2 men with gruff, low voices, moving through the house. The sounds were all wrong. The scrape of his dresser, the thud of boxes being set down in the entryway. My house was being rearranged, exercised. After an hour, it went quiet. I heard a single soft knock on my office door frame. I looked up. He stood there, hollowed out. The bright blue blazer was gone, replaced by a rumpled t-shirt and jeans. He looked thin, sallow, and a decade older. The arrogance, the charm, the radiant energy he'd had with Anya, it was all gone. He was just a man, a failed, empty man. They've got everything, he said. His voice was rough. Good, I said. I didn't get up. He lingered, shifting his weight. He was waiting for something, an absolution, an argument, a sign of life. I gave him nothing. I just looked at him with the same flat, neutral gaze I gave my spreadsheets. You didn't have to do this, Evie, he whispered, his eyes pleading. You didn't have to destroy me. For what? For 50 grand? I leaned back in my chair, the mesh creaking. It was never about the 50 grand, Mark. It was about the lie. You built a system based on deceit and called it progressive. You tried to burn down my house and then complained about the cold. This isn't destruction. This is a correction. This is just the math. He winced, as if I'd slapped him. The math, right. Always the math. You're just cold. You really are. You're happy, aren't you? Sitting here with your clean house and your 7 million. I'm not happy, Mark. I'm not sad, I said, and I was surprised to find it was the absolute truth. I'm just done. The project is over. Anya left me, he blurted out, as if this piece of data would somehow change my analysis. The day after the restaurant, the debt. She said I'd lied to her. She said I was the con man. A flicker of something dark and satisfied moved in my chest. That's a shame, I said, my voice empty of all sympathy. The data was clear. She wasn't a spiritual entrepreneur. She was a parasite, just like you. The host was drained. She moved on. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He saw it finally. The woman he'd married was gone. The auditor was all that was left. I have nothing, Evie, he said, his voice cracking. I'm living in a studio apartment. I'm going to have to declare bankruptcy. You took everything. I didn't take anything, I said, standing up. I walked to the door, stopping a few feet from him. I didn't smell his cologne. He just smelled sour. I protected what was mine. What you signed, what you gave away, you did so with your eyes open, eager to cash in on a lie. Those were your choices. These are the consequences. I gestured to the hallway, where Diane's paralegal was waiting by the front door with the final papers and a notary. You should sign those, so you can be free to start your new life. He looked at me, his eyes wet with pathetic, useless tears. He had no more moves, no more charm, no more gaslighting. He was just a line item, zeroed out. He turned and walked away. I heard the murmur of the paralegal, the scratching of a pen, and then the front door opened. He hesitated for one last second, looking back at the sterile, minimalist living room. He looked at me. It was real, you know, he said, his voice small. At the beginning. It was real. Then he turned and left. The door clicked shut. I walked over and threw the deadbolt. The solid metallic thunk echoed through the house. I was alone. I walked through the rooms. His closet was a cavernous, empty space. The bathroom counter was free of his clutter. The living room was exactly as it had been, minus his books, his laptop, his presents. It was finished. It was perfect. It was sterile. I stood in the center of the vast, quiet room, surrounded by concrete and glass and expensive, uncomfortable furniture. The silence was deafening. I had executed the plan. I had purged the system. I had won. And I was standing in the exact same cold, empty, sterile box I had been in when the story started. 6 months passed. The house no longer smelled of lemons and bleach. Tonight, it smelled of roasting garlic, fresh thyme, and a deep, simmering bolognese that had been on the stove for 6 hours. The sterile silence was gone, replaced by the warm, chaotic sound of Coltrane on the speakers, the clink of wine glasses, and the overlapping, rising and falling cadence of genuine laughter. The white quartz island, once a sterile altar, was now a joyful mess. It was covered in olive pits, breadcrumbs, 3 open bottles of Chianti, and a massive cheese board that was under enthusiastic attack. The low-slung, uncomfortable leather sofa was gone. In its place was a deep, overstuffed sectional in a warm, ink blue velvet. The bare concrete floors were softened by Persian rugs, their patterns a riot of faded crimson and gold. And my office. It was still my office, but the door was open and my friend Maya was using my desk to look up a cocktail recipe on her phone. Evie, more wine, called Ben, a colleague from my data team, holding his empty glass aloft from the sofa. In a second, I called back, my hands covered in flour. I was in the kitchen, actually using it, rolling out pasta dough. You know where it is. He laughed and came over, grabbing a bottle and pouring one for himself and one for me. I still can't believe this is the same house, he said, leaning against the counter. You did, whatever the opposite of minimalist is. I call it maximalist, I said, smiling. I call it actually living in it. I found out I like color and clutter and books that aren't arranged by spine width. It's good on you, Evie. You're lighter. It was true. After the divorce, after the house was finally legally mine, I had felt that strange, echoing void. It had taken a month to realize the void wasn't an absence of Mark. It was an absence of me. I had systematically built a life around his needs, his aesthetics, his fragile ego. I had audited myself out of my own home, so I tore it down. I gave the glass tables and chrome chairs to charity. I painted walls. I bought plants that I was now learning to keep alive. I called old friends I hadn't seen in years. Friends Mark had found boring or unambitious. I had, in short, recalibrated the entire system. Later, I was standing on the patio, breathing in the cool, damp night air. The garden was dark, but I'd strung up small, warm bistro lights. Maya, my oldest friend, joined me, closing the glass door behind her, muffling the party's happy roar. "You really did it, Evie," she said, leaning on the railing. "You look present." "I feel present," I said, sipping my wine. She was quiet for a moment, the way a friend is when they're deciding whether to share a piece of dark gossip. "You know," she said, her voice casual, "Sarah from the old neighborhood called me last week." "Oh?" I said, my pulse giving a single traitorous little kick. "Yeah, she saw him." I gripped the stem of my glass. "Mark? And her?" Maya made a face. "Anya. It wasn't at some chic restaurant either. They were on 82nd, outside one of those grim, boxy apartment buildings with the metal staircases on the outside. Sarah was driving by and had to stop at the light, so she got the full show." I stared out at the dark trees in my own backyard. "What show?" "A full-blown screaming in the parking lot argument," Maya said, her voice flat, devoid of glee, just reporting the facts. "She said he looked awful, thin, greasy hair, just a wreck. He was holding a stack of mail, and she said she could see the red past due stamps even from her car. They were screaming about money, about rent. She said Anya was yelling that he'd ruined her, and he was yelling that she'd never believed in him. Then Anya just got in a beat-up old Honda and peeled out, leaving him there on the sidewalk, holding the mail. I processed the data. The final report. The trajectory I had set in motion had run its course. The parasite had consumed the host, and finding it empty, had moved on, leaving the hollowed-out shell on a dirty sidewalk. I had expected to feel a jolt of triumph, a bitter, cold satisfaction. Instead, I felt nothing. It was just data. A final closing entry in the ledger I'd balanced 6 months ago. He wasn't my problem. He wasn't my anger. He wasn't my failure. He was just a man I used to know, who had made a series of bad, predictable choices. I took a breath. The air smelled of damp earth and the garlic from my kitchen. "Huh," I said. It was the only reply I had. Maya looked at me, searching my face. "You okay?" "I am," I said, and the truth of it resonated in my bones. I turned away from the dark garden and looked back through the glass door, into the light. Ben was now arguing with another friend about a movie, both of them laughing. "Come on," I said, sliding the door open. The warm air, the music, the scent of my dinner, all of it rushed out to greet me. "I think the pasta's ready." I walked back into the noise and the light. I left the door open. Ben saw me, smiled, and handed me my wine glass. I took it, and in that room, surrounded by people who were there because they wanted to be, I felt it, the connection. It wasn't a variable to be tracked. It wasn't a baseline to be audited, or a problem to be solved with rules. It was this. It was the messy, chaotic, warm, and noisy signal of a life. And for the first time, I wasn't just analyzing it. I was a part of it.